The Chancellor promises investment right across society as he prepares for Wednesday's budget. Billions are on the table, says RISHI SUNAK, to help the recovery after COVID.
Children, schools, skills, all of these things, policing and crime, you will see investment across the board in public services.
But acknowledging the rising cost of living, he says he hasn't got a magic wand to wish it away. Also on the programme, senior doctors say rising COVID infections are putting intense pressure on A&E departments in England and call for tougher coronavirus rules. Britain's biggest supermarket chain has its computer systems hacked, affecting millions shopping online. The flat owners facing winter with their homes wrapped in plastic as the government tackles the cladding crisis after Grenfell. And the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen meets Ian Russell, whose daughter Molly took her own life after viewing disturbing content online. Good afternoon. The Chancellor, RISHI SUNAK, says he'll deliver a budget on Wednesday that invests in infrastructure, innovation and skills to grow the British economy as it recovers from the COVID pandemic. He told the BBC there'd be a boost for the NHS and schools, as well as money for services for children, policing and fighting crime. He acknowledged the rising cost of living, but says this is due to global factors and he doesn't have a magic wand to make them disappear. Here's our political correspondent, Nick Eardley.
This is not a time for ideology and orthodoxy.
RISHI SUNAK has been Chancellor at a far from normal time. The man who spent unprecedented sums during the COVID crisis. This week, though, he wants to set out his plans for after the pandemic. And although the Treasury has promised to balance the books, there's a growing list of pledges to be delivered.
One of the elements of building a stronger economy is having strong public services, and you will see that next week, whether it's the NHS, which we've already taken steps to support significantly to recover from coronavirus, children, schools, skills, all of these things, policing and crime. You will see investment across the board in public services because that's what we were elected to deliver and that's what we are getting on and doing.
The government says it wants higher productivity and higher wages, so there will be around £3 billion earmarked for skills, billions too for transport and health research. Commitments this weekend have amounted to more than £20 billion, a sign the spending tap hasn't been turned off completely. Yet in the Treasury, they are keen to get spending under control, and there are concerns about inflation, which could squeeze living standards and cost the government a lot more when it comes to borrowing.
The bulk of that increase is down to two things. One of those is the fact that as economies have reopened rather rapidly after coronavirus, that has put pressure on global supply chains. And then the other part of the increase is very much just down to energy prices. Both of those factors are global factors. We're not alone in experiencing those problems. I don't have a magic wand that can make either of those things disappear.
Labour has warned of a cost of living crisis, higher prices for things like food and energy.
When we pay our gas and electricity bills, 5% of that money goes automatically to the taxman. There's something very simple the government could do. It would be immediate and it would be felt automatically on people's bills next month, and that is to cut that rate of VAT from 5% to 0%.
There will be no blank cheques in the budget as the Treasury moves on from pandemic spending, but there are still big promises to be fulfilled, and they won't be cheap.
And that's the point, isn't it, Nick? No magic wand, but for the government's critics, there is seemingly a magic money tree, and yet RISHI SUNAK has made it clear he's going to balance the books.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, Clive? Because in some ways, RISHI SUNAK, who's finishing off the budget in number 11 this evening, has competing interests to weigh up over the weekend. There are many Conservatives who want him to live up to his rhetoric of bringing spending under control, of starting to repay some of the massive debt that the country accrued during the pandemic. But there are also voters, many of them who backed the Conservatives for the last time at the election, who Boris Johnson's determined to keep hold of, who want Rishi Sunak to spend money on the things that matter to them, the levelling up agenda the government speaks a lot about, on changing the economy in the ways that the government has promised. Now, the details of this will be very important when we get them on Wednesday. There won't be money for everything. There will be some departments and some interest groups who are undoubtedly disappointed by what the Chancellor announces. But based on that interview this morning, Rishi Sunak wanted to emphasise that he is still prepared to spend on a number of things.
OK, Nick, thanks for that. Nick Early there in Downing Street. Senior doctors say rising COVID infections are adding to intense pressure on A&E departments in England and are calling for tougher coronavirus rules as we head into winter. But the government has again ruled out further measures for now, saying the current rate of infections and hospitalisations doesn't suggest changes in England are needed immediately. Here's our health correspondent, Jim Reid.
This, say the government, is our best line of defence against COVID this winter.
You're all boosted. I'm all boosted up.
On the Wirral this weekend, they're giving third booster jabs to the over 50s and other vulnerable groups. Today, Labour added to calls from some doctors' groups for what's called Plan B in England. Wider mask wearing, vaccine passports and more working from home. The Chancellor, though, said there was no immediate need for that.
Although the winter was always going to be challenging through a combination of different factors, the booster rollout should give us the protection we need. And there is a fallback, there is a plan B if we need it.
The number of people in hospital with COVID in England has been rising over the last fortnight, but is no higher now than it was back in mid-September and is well below the level seen at the start of the year. But the NHS is also facing other pressures as the weather gets colder. In September, just 75% of people going to A&E in England were seen within 4 hours. That's the lowest figure on record. And hospitals in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are facing very similar pressure. Some emergency doctors on the front line are warning they are already struggling to cope.
So when I go in to start seeing patients, you just have this enormously long queue of people who have been waiting a long time. At busy times of the day, you find that you've got ambulances outside your emergency department who can't offload because your emergency department is full, because your hospital is full. And you do feel slightly overwhelmed and a little bit helpless.
Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland have had stricter COVID rules than England for some time. The government says its focus is currently on rolling out more vaccines to teenagers, along with those booster doses to over 50s. But speaking today, one government advisor said other measures would be needed.
We do need to have people using lateral flow tests, avoiding contact with large numbers of people in enclosed spaces, using masks. All of those things now need to happen if we're going to stop this rise and get things under control soon enough to stop a real meltdown in the middle of the winter.
That is the concern, that COVID, flu and other pressures make the situation unsustainable for the NHS this winter. The government says it is keeping a close eye on the situation, but for the moment, the data does not justify changing the rules. Jim Reid, BBC News.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show there were 39,962 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average 46,920 new cases were reported per day in the last week. There were 8,238 people in hospital with COVID as of Thursday. 72 deaths were reported. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. On average, in the past week, 124 deaths were announced every day. The UK's largest supermarket chain, Tesco, says an attempt to hack its computer systems is behind problems with its website and app. Shoppers have been unable to book deliveries or amend existing orders for more than 24 hours. Tesco says it's working hard to restore services. Well, our business correspondent Katie Austin is here. Potentially, Katie, millions of people could be affected. Any idea when services will be back up and running?
No, not at the moment. Online ordering, of course, has seen huge growth since the pandemic began. Tesco customers are being told existing orders that were already in the pipeline, if you like, will go ahead if they're 3 items or more. But since yesterday morning, there have been complaints also on social media from customers who have found they can't place, amend or cancel orders of groceries through Tesco's website or their app, which has about 6.5 million users. Tesco has apologised and said this happened because of an attempt to interfere with its systems, it says, which seems to have happened at some point overnight on Friday. A spokesperson added there was no reason to believe customer data had been affected. They said the supermarket was acting to ensure details remained safe. We're told Tesco is working hard to try and resolve these issues, but as I speak to you, the problem seems to be still there. It hasn't yet been fixed.
OK, Katie, thank you. Katie Austin there. The husband of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe has started his second hunger strike to try to secure her return to the UK from Iran. She's been detained since 2016, initially accused of breaching national security. Last week, she lost an appeal against a second conviction for spreading propaganda against the Iranian regime. Her husband, Richard, staged his first hunger strike 2 years ago, which helped lead to the return of their daughter, Gabriella, who'd been travelling with her mother in Iran when she was arrested.
I worry, with the latest news we've had for Nazanin's case, that she's going to be thrown back in prison anytime soon. So I wanted to make an escalation that would get the attention of the British government. But also, in the end, we do need the British government to move.
8 people have been arrested on suspicion of murder after 2 teenage boys died in Essex. The emergency services were called to Regency Court in Brentwood in the early hours of this morning, and police are now working to establish the causes of death. The third person was treated for injuries which were not life-threatening. The BBC has learned that 18 months after the government announced a £1 billion scheme to help tower block owners remove flammable cladding from their homes, funds so far have been allocated to less than a third of nearly 700 applications processed so far. The Building Safety Fund was one of the schemes set up in the wake of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, covering cladding of wood and other flammable laminates. But as Sarah Corker reports, in the few buildings where remedial work has begun, there are fresh problems.
Imagine having to live inside this, your home wrapped in plastic sheeting for months on end, windows that barely open, no way to see out.
Yeah, Sarah, middle of the day, no natural light.
Jim lives on the first floor at Islington Gates here in Birmingham city centre.
And this is the limited air we can get into the flat.
This is the view for the next year that you've got.
Yeah, 12 months of being depressed.
There is relief that the combustible cladding is being removed, but government funding won't cover the full cost of almost £9 million. It means leaseholders need to find more than £1 million between them. That's at least £20,000 each. What's it like living in this box?
You haven't got a clue what's happening outside. It affects you mentally, it makes you depressed, it makes you very stressed. The stress is worse knowing you've got to pay for it, and you've got to pay for the privilege of living in a dark, dull box. In my case, £20,000. And I grind my teeth.
You feel like you're suffocating.
Just next door, Liz and Rodriguez are renting this one-bed flat. They not only have to cope with the building work, but there's a serious damp and mould problem too.
It's horrible. I really hate living here now, to be honest with you, and I feel embarrassed. I don't want to bring my friends here. I don't want to bring my family here because I've got a 6-year-old niece who we absolutely adore, and I don't want her here because I don't want her to be breathing in the sort of same stuff that's making me feel so poorly.
Liz says her asthma has been getting progressively worse. This is footage from a neighbouring flat. With the external cladding removed, this is what can happen when it rains. Hundreds of people here say they face a miserable winter living on a building site. And this is one street in one city, but across the country, we're going to be seeing much more of this in the months and years ahead. This tower in Ipswich has been like this for 5 months. It's a similar picture here in London, and these living conditions are worrying health professionals.
They're stuck there with all the kind of stresses of the physical environment, the financial worries, and the uncertainty about when this is going to end. So we're going to see I think, quite serious mental health issues.
Back in the Midlands, the leaseholder board overseeing this work said it's monitoring issues closely to minimise discomfort. The government told us it's unacceptable people are facing these bills and building owners must make buildings safe without passing on costs. But for Jim and his neighbours, life behind the plastic is hard to bear. Sarah Corker, BBC News in Birmingham.
One of the world's most wanted drug lords has been captured in Colombia in what's seen as the most significant arrest since Pablo Escobar. Hundreds of special forces troops were involved in the operation to seize Dairo Antonio Usuga, known as Otoniel, who'd been hiding out in the jungle. Colombia's president says it's the biggest blow to drug trafficking in the country for 3 decades. The Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen will give evidence to MPs tomorrow on government plans for social media regulation. The American data scientist worked at Facebook for 2 years and today met the campaigner Ian Russell, whose 14-year-old daughter Molly took her own life after viewing disturbing content on Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. Angus Crawford has more details.
She's the former Facebook insider who revealed its most closely guarded secrets.
14-year-old Molly Russell.
He's the father who lost his daughter to suicide, now campaigning to protect other children online.
Nice to meet you.
Today, they met for the first time.
So what do you think the impact of Molly's story was on Instagram as a platform and how it approaches safety?
Facebook is full of kind, conscientious, well-meaning people. The real question is around, can we as a public change the incentives such that it makes more sense for Facebook to invest more money in safety on Instagram? And so I'm sure that the experience that Molly had caused them to look at these questions more. At the same time, we need way more invested in this because we need to make more progress faster.
So one of the things that led us to find out more about Molly was some notes that she left that were found after she died. And in one of them, she wrote, "I keep a lot to myself and it keeps building up inside. You get addicted to it and you don't even realise you've spun out of control. You're living in a trap, in a circle."
What's so dangerous about having children under the age of 16, under the age of 18, using systems like Instagram is that Facebook's own research shows that a startlingly high fraction of them exhibit what is known as problematic use, which means that they can't regulate their own usage of the product. It's kind of like cigarettes in that way. And they know it's hurting their physical health, their schoolwork, or their employment.
As time goes on, as a parent bereaved by the suicide of his 14-year-old, I look at a huge corporation with massive resources and say, there must be more you can be doing.
Unquestionably, Facebook could be investing more resources in making the platform safer. They have made a series of choices to prioritize profits over people.
What do you think regulators can do to persuade those big tech companies to behave differently?
I think on the most basic level, right now, there's no company in the world that has as much power as Facebook and as little transparency.
Frances, thank you so much.
Facebook believes Frances Haugen's evidence gives a false picture of the company, which cares deeply about safety, doesn't allow material promoting self-harm, and has an industry-leading standard for transparency. A whistleblower and a campaigner with one aim: to make social media a safer place. Angus Crawford, BBC News.
Now, with all the sport, here's Lizzie Greenwood-Hughes at the BBC Sports Centre. Hi there, Lizzie.
Hello, thank you, Clive. Good evening. We're starting with a huge Premier League match going on at Old Trafford, where Manchester United are being beaten 5-0 by arch-rivals Liverpool. Mo Salah has scored a hat-trick, making the most of defensive frailties, and we're only two-thirds of the way through the match. United were 4-0 down at half-time for the first time in their history in the Premier League. Well, earlier, West Ham moved into the top 4 after beating Tottenham. Our correspondent Nesta McGregor reports on Spurs' 4th London derby defeat of the season.
The significance of this one, 2 teams who knew 3 points would be enough to secure place in the top 4. In keeping with tradition, bubbles were aplenty, although it was a first half which failed to blow anyone away. Mikel Antonio stuck his right foot out. The Jamaican international celebrated by shaking it all about. The Happy Hammers flying high in the table. Nesta McGregor, BBC News.
So confirmation of that result. And in the other early game, Leicester beat Brentford. Rangers are back on top of the Scottish Premiership. Alfredo Morelos scored his 100th goal for the champions as they fought back from a goal down to beat St Mirren 2-1. Pakistan and India's opening game in the T20 World Cup is living up to expectations as cricket's biggest rivals go head-to-head. Favourites India had a scare in the opening few overs, but captain Kohli hit a half-century as they made 151 for 7. Pakistan are chasing them down, currently 73 without loss in Dubai. In the other match, Sri Lanka beat Bangladesh. Great Britain's Katie Archibald has won her 4th medal of this week's Track Cycling World Championships, taking silver in the points race today by winning the last 2 sprints. The Olympic champion has also won a gold and 2 bronze medals at the event in France. Saracens had their second big win in a row in Rugby Union's Premiership, this time thrashing Wasps 56-15. They were all over a weakened Wasps side as Max Malins was the star again, scoring 4 of the 8 tries to add to his hat-trick from last weekend. There's more on the BBC Sport website, including the build-up to tonight's US Grand Prix, where title rivals Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton start first and second on the grid. Will they clash again? But that's it from me. Back to you, Clive.
OK, Lizzie, thanks for that. And that's it. I'll be back with the late news at 10, now on BBC One. Time for the news where you are. Bye for now.